Welcome to another episode of Meet the Newton Kewak, where we're joined by celebrated author and storyteller Hayden Taylor. Drew will share insights from his journey into writing and discuss his unique approach to storytelling. We'll dive into his latest novel, Cold, which reimagines the Windigo into a modern urban setting and explore the challenges of infusing humor into stories that reflect the experience of the Indigenous people. Drew will also touch on his work in television and plays and share his experiences from life on the reserve and discussing the complexities of his mixed race identity. Awesome, man! It's great to have you on, Drew. As soon as I seen you on APTN, there's a show called Going Native. I was like, oh man, I got to talk to this guy and try to hunt him down. So I'm glad to have you on here. And like everyone I talk to, it's kind of a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and we'll
All
start
right.
with
I
that.
grew up, born, raised, and currently living on the Curve Lake First Nation, an Anishinaabe community in central Ontario, about I would say a half hour north of a town called Peterborough, Ontario. Um, uh, that's basically where I get all my ideas from. I'm what you call a contemporary storyteller. That is to say, in today's world, there's so many different ways of telling stories, and I like to explore as many of them as I can. So I write plays, I write novels, I write television shows, documentaries, creative nonfiction, all these different things. So I think of myself as a contemporary storyteller.
Oh, that's awesome, and I know your list of books and your accolades and awards are we can go on for days just talking about that. But I guess even with that, what got into that? So you call yourself a contemporary storyteller. Like, what got you started in that? Was there a book, or was there a paper that you wrote and then all of a sudden it just
Well, actually, it's kind of I don't know. I've always liked reading, right? I always tell when I get asked that question, I always say I became a writer because I couldn't do anything else. I had no serviceable talent, so I became a writer. But the truth is, growing up on the reserve, it was boring. There's only so many times you can go swimming, climb a tree, whatever in summer, let alone how boring it is in winter. And I was never very good at sports, so I would read. I would read a lot, and the more I read, the more I became fascinated by all the exotic people, places, and things I could meet and do in the world. And I began to think, I'm sure the world might be as boring as my reserve was, like most reserves. I'm sure other people might be interested in some of the things that happen around here. So I began to slowly toy with the idea of being a writer. And it took a long time because I was actively dissuaded from being a writer. I asked my grade 11 English teacher if it was possible to make a living from creative writing. And without even looking up at me, he was at his desk, he said, no, not really. And I told my mother I wanted to be a writer, and my mother said, why do you want to be a writer? It's not going to get you anywhere. So I basically had no encouragement. So I put it away for 10 years, more like 8 years. And then it's a sort of a case of where I didn't exactly go hunting for my art. I didn't come upon my art. I didn't grab my art. My art came, chased me down, kicked me in the butt, and told me you're a writer. So I didn't get back into writing. Well, I never really started writing, but I didn't become a writer until I would have to say my mid 20s. And that was I started writing for television. I started writing humorous articles and essays, a whole bunch of different things. And from there, I went to theater. I went to documentaries. I went to novels and short stories, etc. But the number one reason why I like being a writer, and I think this appeals what appeals to many writers, is the fact that as a writer, I have more control over the world I create than the world I live in, and that appeals to me.
oh man, that's yeah, that really hits, especially growing up on the res, right? Sitting around
Yep,
and just yeah, you can control your
basically,
world, right?
yeah.
Or have
To a certain extent, because I'm also one of those writers who believe that when you're writing something, whether it's a novel or a play or a television movie script, listen to your characters, because sometimes they will take you in a different direction than what you where you want to go. I like to think when I sit down to start to write something, what ends up being written is about 60% of what I planned, and 40% of it is what the character and the story demand. So it's a give and take when you're a writer.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great advice too, because I mean, obviously, that's where it gets where you're. That's how it got to where you're at, and you're not trying to
No.
force anything, right? And hitting that lovely writer's block and all the other fun stuff in between. It's kind of like life. I always do that too. Is trying to enforce my own ideals or my own things. It's like I want this. I want you to act this way. I need this to
I mean,
happen. But
as you said, I've been very successful in my work. I have 35 books out, about 20 plays, all these different things happening. But I've never considered myself an overly ambitious person. Of everything I work in, I always tell people I never took a writing course in my life. I just woke up one day, was a playwright, woke up one day, was a novelist, woke up one day, was writing for television. And it's just a matter of being, basically knowing how to tell a story and knowing the structure of the genre you're working in. Um, Sorry, I was going somewhere with this, but I kind of lost it. Uh,
no, that's okay. And when you say that, the structure of a story, especially the genre, like your new book, Cold, it's more on the. I seen somewhere as a quote, right? It's kind of like the Indigenous X Files. I heard you say, and so with that, like, where's the mindset for that, or like, is it very futuristic and things like that?
my very first novel, I decided to take a European legend and indigenize it and culturally appropriate it. So my very first novel was a native vampire novel. My second novel, I decided why go to other cultures for their legends when we have so many of our own. So I ended up, my second novel was called Motorcycles and Sweetgrass. And it's where I take the trickster and I contemporize him and put him in a modern day 21st century First Nations community, getting involved with all the local politics and still functioning fully as the trickster and getting into mischief there. So what I try and do is, as I said, I take characters from our cosmology and contemporize them. And so with the new novel, Cold, I take the Windigo character, the belief, and contemporize the Windigo character and put him in a contemporary urban environment in downtown Toronto where he goes off and does his thing. And it's these two native characters, one a professor of native literature and the other an over the hill hockey player who come to grips with what it is and have to track it down and do battle with it. So that's basically what I've been working on recently is taking because I remember having a conversation with a traditional storyteller once who told me that and that she thinks we need the new stories as much as we need the old stories. So I sort of take that to heart and I set myself down as a storyteller telling stories the way our elders would tell stories, but in a contemporary format, in literature, and maybe television or movies someday. But yeah, so that's basically the function of when I tell these stories. I'm just I'm reinventing the wheel, so to speak. I'm telling the stories we would have heard across the campfire, across the kitchen table, and just putting them in a book or on television.
Oh, that's great. And those stories need to get out, right? And that needs to be carried on, needs to be told. But it's great that you're doing it in that way and keeping people, I don't know, engaged in just a different avenue and a
Yep,
different way to see it, right? And
and it's fun. That's the important thing I try and tell people. The idea of writing a novel or whatever, or play whatever, can seem intimidating and scary and all that. But in the end, if it's fun, I mean, writing a vampire novel, writing a trickster novel, writing a horror novel, just got to keep in mind it's fun doing it. And when you realize that, it takes a lot of the scariness away. Sorry, the scariness of writing it, not the scariness of a horror novel.
I hear you. Yeah, no, exactly. That's me. Instantly get scared trying to write something, but that's awesome. With writing, I mean, obviously you do so many things with TV and movies and books. And what is there a process that you go through, or does it just happen for you, or do you have to sit down, you have to light a candle, you have to smudge, you have to do certain things, or does it just go?
Well, I don't understand people who have what's called writer's block because I wish I had writer's block. Right now, I'm 30,000 words into a new novel. I have a new play waiting on the edge. I've got another novel to do after this, and I have a new article coming out in the Globe and Mail this weekend, and so on and so on and so on. So I'm always writing. I never have a loss for stories to tell. In fact, I think in terms of stories, books, and plays, I think I'm booked up for the next 8 years. So but how it happens is it's not so much, um, how can I put this? Uh, Depends on the size of what you're working on. If I'm working on a short story or an article or something like that, it's, it takes a couple days to think about whatever, to sit down and start writing and finish it. However, if I'm working on a novel or a movie or a play, I think about it for a couple months. Um, I think about it until I know I've worked out the nuances of the story. I know where it begins, where it ends, what the story arc is, what the characters arc are, so that when I sit down, I can start writing it. And if it's a full length play, I can do it in less than 2 weeks. If it's a novel, hopefully I can do it in 4 months, 5 months, something like that. But I'll let you in on a secret. I actually hate writing. If I could do anything else, I would, but I have no serviceable talents, so I became a writer. Now, when I say I hate writing, I'm referring to a comment that a wonderful, wonderful writer from the 1940s, a woman named Dorothy Parker, once said. She says, I hate writing, but I love having written. So the actual process of writing is very, very difficult. It's painful. You'd rather be doing anything else, but then once you're done, you sort of look at it and go, oh, that wasn't too bad. I would do that again. Um, for a novel and a play, for the big projects, because I hate writing, I don't do outlines. A lot of people do outlines. I know one guy who does this massive, massive outline of every novel, and then when it's time to write it, all he does basically is go in and put in dialogue. It's so well thought out. I'm not like that because, as I said, I hate writing. So writing an outline is the equivalent of just more writing, more useless writing. But I think about it. I ponder it in my head. I'm walking down the street. I'm doing the dishes. I'm in the shower. Any of a number of different things, and I'm thinking about the story, the characters, the art. A leads to B, all these different things. And as I said, when I know what the beginning, the middle, the end, the story arcs, when I get most of that thought out, I'd say 60% of it thought out, I sit down and I start writing, whether it's a novel or whatever. And I start at the beginning and I go through to the end. And as I said, sometimes if you listen to your characters and your story, they'll take you on unexpected journeys. But I know some writers who will start a project having absolutely no idea what they're writing. I used to know a guy who said, I'd sit down and I have no idea where my fingers are going to take me. I'm not like that. I have to know the ending of my story before I can begin. So I sit and I think about projects for 6 months to a year. And when I'm ready, I sit down and I write it. So I don't make notes, but sometimes what I do, I do admit this now as I'm getting older, I make notes on small things. A funny line, a small little thing, like there's a stuffed bear on a shelf. Little things that will help add to the story, but are not really that important. Primarily because the big things I will remember. Because the big things, it's literally A will lead to B, B will lead to C, C will lead to D, and so on and so on and so on. So that'll all run together. I can't, if there's a hole between, M and O, I just think about it, and then there's the logical progression to get from here to here. That will make me remember, oh yeah, that was going to go there. So I remember all that stuff, but it's the small stuff I will forget. And it's the details that where you'll find God or the devil. And so yeah, so I that's basically how I work. I sit, I ponder, and when I'm ready to rock and roll, I go in and I write. Now, when I say I spend 6 months to a year working on a project, I also want to stress that I'm not just sitting there 6 months thinking, not doing anything else. I work on different projects at different times in different stages of development. Um, because it's like working out in a gym, right? Um, one day you'll work on your legs and your core. The next day you'll work on your back and shoulders. The next day you'll work on your arms and whatever else. I find when I'm writing a play is different than working on an article, which is different than working on a television show. I can use different muscles when I'm doing those things. Like, but I can only work on one novel at a time, or one play at a time, or whatever. But I've got always got different irons in the fire, as they say.
Yeah, no, that's great, man. That's an awesome. Thanks for telling us that thing. Because I mean, there's so many different ways to skin a cat, I guess, or whatever you want to say, right? And
Oh
notes and
yeah, yeah. I
storyboards.
mean, I mentioned this earlier about structure, right? The hardest part of writing is understanding the structure of what you're saying. Television has the most strict structure. When you're going in to write a television show, you're basically putting clothes on an existing structure. Theater is a slightly broader structure, so is writing a novel. So you come in and you have more leeway. So I tell people, learn the structure of what you're doing, how you're going to tell your story, what you're trying to say, how you're trying to say it, and who you're saying it through. Once you get those down, that makes it as easy as possible. Or somebody was asking me once, give me the easiest way to write a story, the easiest structure. And I said, okay, think about your story. What's your opening line? What's your closing line? Now connect them. And sometimes that's a novel, sometimes that's 300 pages, sometimes it's 8 pages.
Yeah, I know exactly, right? That's funny. It's so hard, eh, when someone just asks you that. Come on, tell me. Or when you're funny, like you're a funny guy, right? I mean, you stand up in different things.
Well, that's the other question, right? About humor. How can you write humor? And it's really really difficult. It's like either you're funny or you're not, or either you're funny for writing it, funny in person, any of a number of ways. But what I like to tell people is, we can't teach you to be funny. We can't teach you to be a brilliant writer. What we can do is teach you to be funnier or better. There has to be that spark there already. If you don't know how to tell a joke, if you don't know how to respond or be funny originally, we can't teach you to be funny. But we can, if you have that spark already. Same with writing. We can teach you to
Yeah,
take it
certainly. Yeah. No,
further.
that always reminds me of like guys sitting around or on a job site or something, right? You can be funny there because you're working off people, or if you're a stand up, you're funny there, but maybe in just your daily life, it's you're kind of
Yeah.
more of a subdued person, and it always makes me laugh, right?
Well, yeah, people don't really understand like the life of we've both heard it so many times. People saying, "Oh, you should be a stand-up comedy or a comedian, or you should go into television and be so funny." Stuff is, you know, again, when you're a stand-up comedian, you have to craft that joke perfectly for that environment, and you will say it basically, I don't know, 4 to 6 times a week for the next 6 to 10 months. That one joke, because comedians have a set routine that they do for a period of runs. So it's not make that one time it's funny. It has to be funny the 74th time, the 120th time, etc. It has to be the same, if not better. And same with acting, right? Just walking in and saying a funny line, you have to know what the line is in reference to. You have to know how to deliver it, who you're delivering it to. And again, if it's in theater, you have to be able to deliver it 3 dozen times the same way or just better. It's, yeah, people just
No,
can't
exactly,
wake
right.
up
And
one
you're
morning and be
talking about
funny.
that, like structure, timing, all these things have to line up and hit. And it always laugh because I always think of
Yeah.
Joe Pesci, right? It's like you're funny. You're like funny how? It's like what do you mean? But that's what it always reminds me of.
Yeah. Hopefully
Yeah,
not.
exactly, right.
Hopefully
Need a
it has a
better ending
better
than that.
ending.
That's great, and thank you for getting into that because I'm as far from a writer as you could possibly imagine. So it's great to hear some of that and hear some of the ins of that. When you were speaking, I did have a question about. So you kind of got into writing in your 20s or later 20s. What was that in between time like from high school, we'll say, to writing?
Well, as I said, I was openly discouraged from being a writer, but I loved the arts because in the arts you get to, if you know what you're doing and you're with the right people and right environment, you can create wonderful creations out of just sheer imagination. And I like that. So if I couldn't be a writer, I wanted to hang out with writers or in the arts. And I wanted to be in the arts. I wanted to be a hanger on. I'm with the band, a wannabe, whatever, with the arts. So I ended up going to college for radio and television broadcasting, and I learned how that worked. And then from there, when I graduated, I had a number of jobs. I never had a career. I just lurched from project to project, trying to feed this horrible, terrible, voracious, bottomless pit of a monster that followed me called a landlord who always liked to be fed. And so I would do all these different contracts that were in the arts, but not as an artist. I did location sound on several documentaries. I worked for CBC Radio as a trainee producer. I worked for the Canadian Native Arts Foundation, which is now called Inspire. And I ended up working for a film company that was doing a 13-part series about life on a fictional reserve in northwestern Ontario. And as was the custom at the time, the producers were non-native, the directors were non-native, the writers were non-native, and a third of the cast was non-native. And I literally phoned them up and said, you should hire somebody to come and work for you that's from a reserve. And I did. They said, sure, come in. I went in, interviewed, and I got a job there. And that was actually very, very beneficial because I learned how a half-hour television show worked and how a half-hour television script was written and shot. So after that series ended, I ended up writing an article for a magazine on adapting native stories into a television and film format. From there, I talked with the story editor of a television series, and one of us suggested I submit some story ideas just for the heck of it. I did. I wrote it. They bought it. They shot it, and they aired it. And at the age of 25, I was the first native scriptwriter in Canada, and that was for a series called The Beachcombers. As I said, I was 25, and from there I went and did Street Legal, North of
Oh man,
60,
you're just
etc., etc.
instantly get nostalgic. I had Channel 3 and Channel 8, and I'm from northern Saskatchewan, so it's always like yeah, Street Legal. I remember that one. It's just like all this stuff is that's awesome, man. That's great.
Yep.
It's exciting to hear that. With that being said, right? Like I'm big on this show on giving people something to look up to, something to aspire to, someone that's been there, done that, and moving forward. And you have a very untraditional path as well. And with the youth looking to get started in something like that, right? Like wanting to be a writer, wanting to get into television, is is that school or that college route kind of the way to network, meet people, get in that zone, or can it happen? I don't know, not organically, but can it just happen um, just by happenstance?
Well, I mean, that is a hard question to answer because things have changed so much since I was in school. When I was in school, there were no native writers anywhere. And it was very hard to break into anything. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. Education is always great. In fact, I think back when I was starting out, when there was that first flood from what I refer to as the contemporary native literary renaissance, when suddenly there were all these plays and novels coming out of the First Nations community. I think the vast majority of playwrights at that time, other than Thompson Highway and Daniel David Moses, really didn't have go to university for theater. They were telling stories from their own childhood, stuff that they wanted to tell. Um, but today, I think the vast majority of native playwrights out there have a university background and are coming from that environment. And I think that's a good thing. Education is
Certainly,
always
certainly, and
important.
I've been harping on that one.
Now, what I would tell people above and beyond education, I often get asked, when I lecture to young people, um, what would I suggest to them if they want to become a writer? And I suggest three rules. One, and they're primarily cliches, all good writers are good readers, and all great writers are great readers. If you heard me say I've never taken a writing course in my life, but I have in my life, I think, read tens of thousands of books. And every book I would read would, one way or another, it was like a brick in the wall of my creation, where it would, I would learn again character development, story development, plot arcs, etc., just by reading through osmosis. It would just soak in. And so when I sat down to write my novel, having never taken a writing course in my life, I sort of knew how to do it because I knew that structure. Same writing a play, it took me a little while to get cred, but it eventually worked that way. Television, all that sort of stuff. I learned by reading, by watching, and then by doing. And so I advise that with young people. You know, the more you read, the more
Oh yeah, that's
training that will
great.
give you. Secondly, secondly, there's no such thing as a good writer, only good rewriters, right? I have actually had a play produced on a first draft, and I swore never again. Um, I use at least the three draft rule. First draft is for story, second draft is for characters, third draft is to tie everything up. Sometimes there'll be a fourth or a 20th draft, but I never get anything published or produced with less than three drafts. Just because you have to work out nuances. You'll skip stuff when you're writing the story, or you're writing just the character, you're fine tuning the characters or whatever. So I tell people, no such thing as a good writer, only a good rewriter. And that works for um, high school and university essays too. You know, when I write articles for magazines, which are equivalent of an essay, I write the first draft and I come back and I do a second draft because your mind doesn't catch details when you're creating it. It catches details
Are you the
when you're
one going
finishing.
through? Sorry, are you the one going through
Same with humor.
and kind of critiquing your own work, or do you have
Yeah, until I send it off, and then an editor at the newspaper or the magazine critiques it and
Okay, I'm
does
just saying
their
when I say
kick
that
at
I'm
the
like
can.
most Indigenous men or most Indigenous. I don't take criticism well, so then you hear it, you're like, I was so good. You don't even know what you're talking about, right? So, yeah,
Well, when they pay you and you have a public, when people will see a mistake and tease you for it, you
absolutely.
want
No, I
that, you want
understand.
that correction. And the third thing I tell young people is, if you want to be an interesting writer, try and lead an interesting life. So when I say that, I'm saying don't spend all your time in the basement playing video games. That's, then you'll only be able to write stories about playing video games. Try and have an interesting life. Do things, go places, join clubs, do sports, um, uh, uh, fall in love, have your heart broken, steal a car, spend the night in jail, all these wonderful things that will help you when you're writing. All these different experiences will add to the mosaic of who you are, and who you are helps write
Yes,
what you want to
yes,
write.
that's a great piece of advice. Live your life. I know it's awesome. I love that.
I mean, you look at these great writers like Joseph Conrad, Ernest Hemingway, Jack London. They led amazing, amazing lives, and as a result, they became amazing, amazing writers. So I tell people, the more things you do, the more
Oh, that's
bullets you put
awesome.
in your
That's great for
gun to
life, like
write.
for career, for anything, right? I mean, it just be an interesting person, right?
I think
Be that
so.
guy or be that girl that people want to talk
Hmm.
to and have questions and have fun stories and be able to laugh. That's great. Uh man. With that, okay, so with that being said, like with living your life, and that's where maybe with going native, we can talk a little bit about that, about the show. How did you come to them or did they come to you, or how did that kick off?
Well, from what I remember happening is, right, I and a guy named Paul Kemp and a guy named Kurt Spinrath, we did a documentary for CBC called chasing or seeking, no, searching for Winnetou, which was an exploration of the German fascination with native culture. Because I've been to Germany 20 times. They're just bonkers for native culture. They, as I said, they always brought me over to lecture on native culture, native history, native literature, native humor, all these different things. And the irony being, I look more German than native. But based on this bizarre fascination, we did a documentary for CBC on it that was quite interesting and quite funny. And APTN saw it and they loved it. And they actually said, why aren't we doing things like this? Right. And since then, for CBC, we did two other documentaries, one on called Cottagers and Indians, which is based on a play of mine about native, non-native conflicts involving land and water issues. And then we did a documentary on Pretendians. But APTN, when they saw that first one, we had a meeting about doing a half-hour show where we explored things from a kind of a humorous perspective all across Canada and the States, and that's what we did in the first show and the second show, season, I should say, and in the third season, we decided to go a bit broader and talk with Indigenous people in different parts of the world. So season 3, which comes out later this month, we spend a couple of episodes with the Maya in the Yucatan Peninsula. We go to New Zealand, we go to Australia, and so on and so on. So those documentaries, based on writings I'd done about my trips to Germany, because I wrote a play about the German fascination with native culture called the Berlin Blues. So the play led to the
Holy
documentary,
man,
led to the
hey, that's
television
quite the
series.
journey, and that's awesome, man. With so with season 3, and especially going to other continents and going all over the world, do you see any correlations with Indigenous, Canada versus New Zealand versus, or not versus, but with everybody? Is there a few real commonalities there?
Well, I mean, in the Yucatan, there's still, it's really hard to say. In the Yucatan, the culture is still very, very strong. The language is still very, very strong in places. Australia, they still have huge problems with racism, and they're still dealing with really, really important issues. Right? It used to be like this is the interesting one. Up until 1967, the government department that looked after the issues of the Indigenous people of Australia was a sub bureau of the Department of Flora and Fauna, which flora and fauna means animals and plants. So the Indigenous people of Australia were considered plants or animals in that department up until 1967. So they're still dealing with a lot of these issues. But one of the interesting things they do have going is they're developing a really great ecotourism. We were up in Cairns, up in the north, and the indigenous people up there are doing amazing things with ecotourism. So it's good. Like, we like to focus on the good news, obviously. And New Zealand, I mean, New Zealand, they have guaranteed Indigenous representation in their parliament. They have, I forget the term, but where the language is taught in schools, all these wonderful things. So I think Australia or New Zealand has so many things that Canada and Canada's
Oh,
Indigenous
that's
people
that's great
can
to
learn
hear, because
from.
I definitely want to branch out in that direction, and I get so laser focused, or maybe the blinders on issues right in front of me all the time, which is a good thing as well, but I want to kind of broaden that horizon a little bit and just see how other people live, right? I mean, I did that in my own life, and we lived in London or the UK for a couple of years, right? And it was just nice to see how the other side lives and see how things happen. And it's
Mhm.
and that's an important one. And I talk to a lot of youth about that. Like, at least get out of your zone, get out of the province, like something, right? If possible, just to see how. Yeah,
Yeah, go see the world. The world's an interesting place.
exactly, right.
Home will
And
always be
that's the
there.
hard part, and that's where, I mean, it's stemmed with a lot of things wrapped up in it, but just getting the youth moving, getting them out, getting the young people doing other things besides staying home, right? I used to see it lots with hockey players in my generation of awesome opportunities, getting to play in these great places, and then they come home after 2 3 weeks, right, being homesick or something, and it's hard.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like in the month of next month, May, I'm going with I'm very much a res boy. I grew up on the res. I went moved to Toronto for 20 years to work and chase girls and all that sort of stuff. And then I turned around, went back in my 40s. So I consider myself very much a res guy, but I appreciate the world outside the res. In Toronto, my partner and I, we have a place in Toronto because let's face it, the reserve doesn't have a lot of Thai or Greek food. Um, on my reserve, I am the theater district. Um, there's no international airport on my reserve either. So I enjoy Toronto. I really do coming to Toronto, having the food, going to theater, all these different things. I prefer living at home, but I like to see what Toronto has to offer. Next month, me and four cousins, just for the heck of it, no real reason, are going to Ireland for a week. Not for business, not for nothing. We've just always wanted to go to Ireland. We're going to go see Ireland. Um, us five res brats coming back, and then a week later, my partner and I were going to Mexico to hang out at a resort and soak up some of the Mexican culture. So I'm all about seeing the world because I know in a week
Right.
or two I'll
No,
be
that's
back
that's
home.
great, right? And when you say I love that. I love the traveling and yeah, getting out there and seeing things. When you say you're a res guy, I meant to ask you that because we joked a little bit before this call of the blue-eyed Indian that you go by, and I heard that people seems to be the moniker, and I always joke my sons they get that a lot. My youngest, he looks a little bit more. His name's Bear or Musqua, right? So he's actually living to that moniker, but my oldest, he's the fairest looking Indian you'll ever find, but big long braid on him to keep that strong. But what was it like for you living on the reserve? Was there? I mean, maybe you're just that guy, or I guess when they grew up, it wasn't like you just came in. You were Drew, right? So it's just what it was.
Well, at the same time, I come from both a big family and a small family. I come from a big family because my mother was the oldest of 14. And that's what used to happen before they had the internet. So with all that, with marriages, I had about 20, 21 aunts and uncles and but more than that first cousins. So essentially, I was related to practically everybody on the reserve. We had a small reserve when I was growing up, about 800 people, if that. Um, and so everybody knew me, everybody was related to me. So it actually wasn't a problem growing up. I didn't realize it was a problem until I moved to Toronto, where it became apparent to me, to both white and non and native people, that I didn't look or act the way most people thought native people should act. So I didn't really, it wasn't really something I dealt with until I left the reserve, until my basically my very late teens and 20s. And by the time I was getting into my 30s, I developed a name and people know who I was and where I came
I
from and
understand.
all
I
of that.
understand. With with that journey, I'm cognizant of time, so I'll let you go here. Just with that journey, and I know you did a documentary on like pretendians, right? Did you have to deal with that a lot of, I don't know, somehow having to prove yourself, or like, I don't know, like prove your Indians, like what do you want me to do? Like I can crush a Pepsi and
Yeah. Well, yes. Back in my late 20s, I actually wrote an essay that has become quite famous. It's called "Pretty Like a White Boy: The Adventures of a Blue-Eyed Ojibwe," and it was an essay just basically about what it was like living in the city of Toronto, growing up on the reserve, traveling around to First Nations communities. I've been, I think, to over 150 First Nation communities in Canada and the States. And sometimes I had to deal with this issue, and it was problematic. It was annoying, and so I just wrote an essay, just very angry about it, and that's where I coined the term. I'm half Ojibwe and half Caucasian, so technically that makes me an occasion, a special occasion, if not a memorable occasion. Um, and it became increased. It became the essay is still taught. I bumped into a woman who was selling me popcorn at a theater, and she asked if I was Drew Hayden Taylor, and she said she'd just written an essay about my essay, and I wrote that 30 years ago, but people really like it because it deals with culture, it deals with identity, but it does it through humor, and people find it very accessible, and it just gets taught and taught again in sociology, in essay writing, in Indigenous studies, etc. So yeah, I had some problem with it, and usually when any native person got angry at me or whatever, their usual insult was, "You're not native." Um, so, but the interesting thing is, after the Pretendians came out, and I mean it's a very politically volatile issue, and as a result, I got flack from it. But what's interesting is I got flack from both sides. I got flack from people saying that I wasn't brutal enough, that I didn't out enough people, that there are, and they gave one person actually from Saskatchewan who said that the whole documentary was invalid because there was one person they want outed that I didn't out, and I didn't out anybody in the not play the documentary. We were exploring the issue, not really doing it to out people. So people thought I wasn't vicious, cruel, or antagonistic enough. But on the other hand, there's a whole group of people who said, who made you the gatekeeper for who's native and not native? And this is, let me get the phrase right. Um, you're a scum sucking, white passing, um, pretendian hunting.
There you go. At least
Jerk.
there are.
Right? So it's like I couldn't
Holy
win
man,
either
yeah, I
way.
guess yeah, you just gotta be who you be, hey, and that's all you can do. Like, holy cow. Yeah, no, you're not gonna make anyone
Yep.
happy, and it always makes me laugh. And I just mentioned this yesterday on another show. It was just with I had a guest, John Langdon. He's quite the interesting guy, and I remember him saying that as a quote of just like it's cool to be it's gonna be cool to be Indian. Everyone wants to be an Indian. Everyone wants to be Indigenous. And
Yep.
yeah,
It
exactly,
has
right? Yeah,
cachet now.
tell me that when when all the other stuff was happening, hey, it's like no, I'm not. Yeah,
Exactly, for in when there was residential schools
yeah, getting dragged
and
away. Yeah,
scoop
serial
ups.
native then. So, well, no, that's great, man. And I mean, I could go on for days, but I understand, and you're a busy guy, and hopefully we can do this again another time because you're so interesting, and again, it's so foreign to me this world because I am not a. I always joke I don't read good, and no one ever gets that joke, but. It's so it's great to hear your insights on writing and your insights on travel and life, and it's just great to see. And again, that show going native was great because it just highlights more of what we're trying to do on on the positive, right? It's so easy to get cynical, so easy to get down, so easy to see all the
Yeah,
negative, but we have to
I'm
be,
all about the
and yeah,
positive.
it's just
Yes.
going to create more positivity, and we can start to drown out some of the negative stuff. um that's awesome. So I guess with that being said, where's the best way for people to find you or see what you're up to and what you have going on?
I have a website. I also have a Twitter site at the
Okay,
DH
no,
Taylor.
perfect. I'll make sure I put all that in the show notes, and I'll put your website, definitely a link to the new book as well. No, that's great, man. Well, I really appreciate your time, and
Cool.
thanks for doing this, and it was awesome. Deadly,
It
deadly. I'll
was
talk to you
fun.
soon.
Miigwech.